The cursed VHS Mark had worked at Blockbuster for years. He loved movies. And even though people were starting to use DVDs and streaming services, there was something special about VHS tapes. They had a certain charm. The job wasn't exciting, but it was easy, and he liked the quiet nights when few customers came in. One stormy evening, the wind howled outside as rain slammed against the windows. Mark sighed, glancing at the clock. Just another hour until closing. The store was empty, except for the rows of tapes neatly stacked on shelves. He had already done most of his work for the night, and all he had to do was wait. Then, the door swung open suddenly, making the small bell above it jingle violently. A man rushed inside, dripping wet from the rain. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting around as if he were being followed. He walked straight to the counter and slammed down a VHS tape. "I never rented this," the man muttered. His voice was shaky. Mark frowned and picked up the tape. There was no label, no markings, just a plain black cassette. "Are you sure? Maybe someone in your family did." "No. No one in my house rents tapes anymore. We don't even have a VCR." The man shook his head, backing away. "Just take it back. I don't want it." Before Mark could ask more questions, the man turned and hurried out the door, disappearing into the rain. The bell jingled again, and then there was only silence. Mark looked down at the VHS. There was no record of it being checked out, and it had no label. His gut told him something was off, but he shrugged. Maybe it was just an old tape that got mixed up with rentals by accident. His shift finally ended, and after locking up the store, Mark sat behind the counter. The curiosity was too strong. He grabbed the VHS, walked to the back room where the old TV and VCR sat, and popped in the tape. The screen flickered with static before an image appeared. It was the inside of Blockbuster. His Blockbuster. But something was wrong. The shelves looked older, and the employees on the screen weren't anyone he recognized. The clothes, the hairstyles, everything looked slightly off, as if it was from another time. Then, he noticed the timestamp. The tape said it was recorded 5 years into the future. A chill ran down Mark's spine. That wasn't possible. Was this some kind of prank? Maybe a lost security tape? But how could it be from the future? He kept watching. The store in the video was busier than it was now. People moved around, renting tapes, laughing, chatting. Then, the screen flickered again. The customers disappeared. The store was empty. The only person left was a man sitting behind the counter. Mark leaned in closer. The man in the video. It was him. Same uniform, same posture. He was sitting in the exact spot Mark was sitting in now. Then, something shifted behind him. A shadow. A figure standing behind the counter. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The shadow in the tape grew clearer. It was a tall, dark figure with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. The figure slowly turned its head, looking directly into the camera, looking directly at him. A loud noise made Mark jump. The store alarm had gone off. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, looking around. The store was empty. Nothing was there. The TV screen had turned to static. He turned off the VCR, yanking the tape out. His hands were shaking. He glanced at the dark reflection on the TV screen and froze. There was a shape behind him. Mark spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty air. He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe. The rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He went home, but barely slept. The next morning, as soon as he got to work, He checked the security footage from the previous night. It was corrupted. Every second of it was static. His stomach dropped. That had never happened before. Then, he went to grab the VHS tape from the back room. It was gone. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening in the store. Mark would hear whispers when no one was around. Sometimes, when he passed the horror section, he swore he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. One night, a customer came to the counter, confused. "Hey, man, is this some kind of joke?" Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" The customer placed a VHS on the counter. It was the same unlabeled tape. "I found this on the shelf, but it wasn't in a case. Thought you should know." Mark's stomach turned. He grabbed the tape and ran to the back room, locking the door behind him. Taking a deep breath, he played it again. The footage had changed. Now, the timestamp was only 1 year in the future. And in the video, he wasn't behind the counter anymore. He was in the horror section, standing still, staring at the tapes. Then, the shadowy figure appeared again. But this time, it was closer, right behind him. Mark felt his body go cold. He hit stop. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He had to find out what this was. He grabbed the tape and drove home. He planned to destroy it, burn it, smash it, anything to get rid of it. But when he arrived at his apartment, the tape was missing. It had vanished from his bag. That night, he heard tapping on his bedroom window. He lived on the 3rd floor. Days passed. Mark tried to forget about it, but the sense of dread never left him. He even considered quitting his job. But then, one night, an elderly woman came into the store. She looked around, running her fingers over the shelves as if remembering something. When she reached the counter, she smiled sadly. "You work here?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. Has the tape found you yet?" she asked quietly. His blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed. "It's been happening for years. That tape shows up. People watch it. And then, things happen. I used to work here a long time ago. The same thing happened to me." Mark's mouth went dry. "What did you do?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "I ran. I left this town and never came back. But it always finds its way to someone else. It doesn't stop." Mark didn't know what to say. He had no idea if she was crazy or telling the truth. But deep down, he felt it. The tape wasn't done with him yet. That night, as he closed the store for what he decided would be the last time, he caught his reflection in the dark TV screen. There was something behind him. The screen flickered to static, and then the lights went out. The customer who never left Lisa had always loved books. Ever since she was a child, she could lose herself in stories for hours, living inside their worlds. That's why she was excited when she got a job at Page Turner's bookstore, a small but cozy shop in the heart of town. It wasn't a big store, but it had character. The wooden shelves were packed with books of every genre, and the scent of old pages filled the air. The place felt magical. She had worked there for about 6 months and had gotten used to the quiet evenings. Most customers came in during the day, leaving the nights slow and peaceful. Sometimes it felt a little too quiet, but Lisa didn't mind. That changed one Tuesday night. It was around 9:30 p.m., and Lisa was the only employee working. The store closed at 10 o'clock, so she began her usual routine, tidying up, putting books back on shelves, and wiping down the counters. The soft hum of music played from the speakers, and outside, the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. The night seemed like any other. Then she saw him. An old man stood near the horror section, scanning the shelves. His posture was slightly hunched, and he wore an old-fashioned brown coat. His hair was thin and gray, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. Something about him seemed off, not in a scary way, just unusual. She hadn't noticed him come in, which was strange, considering how empty the store was that evening. Lisa smiled and walked over. "Hi, sir. Let me know if you need any help." The man didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just stood there, staring at the books, his fingers brushing over the spines as if searching for something specific. Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe he was just hard of hearing. She cleared her throat. "The store closes in about 20 minutes, but take your time." Still, no response. Lisa felt uneasy, but she tried to shake it off. Some customers were just quiet. Maybe he was deep in thought or had trouble hearing. She decided to leave him alone and finish her closing duties. Minutes passed. The clock hit 9:50 p.m., and the man hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, staring at the same shelf. Lisa glanced at him, then at the clock. It was time to start locking up. She hesitated before walking back to him. "Sir, we're about to close. Would you like to buy anything?" This time, the man moved. Slowly, he turned his head towards her, and Lisa's stomach tightened. His eyes were dark and hollow, and his thin lips curled into a small, strange smile. Then he whispered, "I never leave." Lisa let out a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. Maybe he was joking? Maybe he was just an eccentric old man? Either way, her shift was ending, and she wanted to go home. "Okay, sir. Well, have a good night," she said, forcing a smile. She turned off the lights. The store went dark except for the glow from the street lights outside. She walked to the front, locked the door, and glanced back inside. The man was gone. Lisa frowned. That was impossible. She hadn't heard the door open. She hadn't seen him leave. The only exit was the front door, which she had been standing by. A chill ran through her body. Where did he go? Her mind raced with explanations. Maybe he had left earlier, and she just didn't notice. Maybe she had imagined him. But no, he had been there. She had spoken to him. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, Lisa hurried home. But that night, she couldn't sleep. The old man's whisper echoed in her mind. "I never leave." The next day, Lisa arrived at work feeling tired and unsettled. The store opened at 10 o'clock, and her boss, Mr. Carter, was already there, sorting through paperwork behind the counter. "Morning, Lisa. You okay? You look a little pale." Lisa hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy, but she needed answers. "Hey, Mr. Carter, did you check the security footage from last night?" He raised an eyebrow. "No." "Why?" "Something weird happened. I saw an old man in the store, but when I locked up, he was gone. I swear I never saw him leave. Can we check the cameras?" Mr. Carter sighed, but nodded. He pulled up the security footage on the computer behind the counter. Together, they watched the video from the night before. Lisa felt her heart pound as the footage showed her walking through the store, tidying up. Then, at 9:30 p.m., she approached the horror section and she was talking to no one. Lisa's stomach dropped. On the screen, she stood alone, speaking to empty air. There was no old man, no brown coat, nothing. Her hands went cold. "No, that's not right." He was there. I saw him. I talked to him. Mr. Carter watched the footage with a tired expression, as if he had seen this before. Then he sighed. So, you met Arthur. Lisa looked at him confused. Who? Arthur used to work here in the 90s. He was a quiet guy, kept to himself, loved the horror section. One night, he stayed late to do inventory, and Mr. Carter hesitated. He had a heart attack in the stockroom. Didn't make it. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. What? Yeah. Mr. Carter rubbed his temples. People say they've seen him. Customers. Employees. He never causes trouble. Just shows up sometimes. Don't worry. He's harmless. Lisa's mind reeled. Harmless or not, she had spoken to a ghost. That night, she made a decision. She would never work alone again. The haunted tape Jason had always thought of his job at the old video rental store as boring. It was a quiet place, barely staying in business, and most people had moved on to streaming movies. But the owner, Mr. Collins, refused to shut it down. Some things deserve to last, he always said. Jason didn't argue. It was an easy job, and he got to watch all the free movies he wanted. That night, Jason was working alone. It was almost closing time, and the store was empty. The neon open sign buzzed softly in the window, and the old ceiling fan creaked as it spun. He was finishing up his routine, checking returns, wiping down the counters, and making sure everything was in place. Then he heard it. A strange, familiar sound. The whirring of a VHS tape rewinding. Jason froze. No one else was there. The only VHS player was in the employee lounge, and he hadn't turned it on all night. He walked slowly toward the sound, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. When he reached the return bin, he found a single tape sitting inside. The title on the cover was faded, but he could just make out the words. The Watching. Jason frowned. He didn't remember anyone renting that movie recently. He had worked at the store for almost a year and had never seen it checked out. The cover was old and worn, and the case felt strangely cold in his hands. Then, the TV in the lounge turned on by itself. Jason spun around, startled. He could hear the faint crackle of static. Slowly, he walked to the lounge and peeked inside. The TV screen was flickering, and then an image appeared. It was a scene from The Watching. He recognized it as the final scene of the movie, though he had never actually seen it before. On the screen, a man sat in a video store, just like this one. He was watching himself on the screen, looking nervous. Behind him, in the reflection of the glass, a dark figure was creeping closer. Jason's stomach tightened. It looked too real. He took a step back. But then something even worse happened. The TV screen flickered again. The scene changed. Now it showed Jason, standing in the exact spot where he was at that very moment. Jason's breath caught in his throat. Then, on the screen, the shadowy figure appeared behind him. Jason turned, heart pounding. There was nothing there. But when he looked back at the TV, the figure on the screen lunged toward him. The screen cut to black. The VHS tape ejected from the player with such force that it shot across the floor, skidding under the couch. The air in the room felt heavy, like the pressure before a storm. Jason didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted out of the lounge, grabbed his keys, and ran straight out of the store. He never came back. A week later, Mr. Collins came in to open the store. He found the place just as Jason had left it, except for one thing. The Watching was sitting neatly on the shelf, right where it had always been. but no one had checked it in. The employee who wasn't there, Sarah, had always loved movies. Ever since she was a kid, she would spend hours watching films, memorizing lines, and imagining herself in different stories. So, when she got a job at Blockbuster, she was thrilled. It was the perfect place for someone like her, a place full of movies, stories, and nostalgia. She started working at the store on a Monday evening. Her first shift was quiet, with only a few customers coming in to rent movies. The smell of popcorn filled the air, and the bright fluorescent lights gave the place a warm glow. It felt cozy, almost like stepping into another time. Her manager, Mr. Dawson, was a kind but serious man in his late 50s. He had worked at Blockbuster for decades, and he took his job seriously, even though most people thought of video rental stores as a thing of the past. "We still have loyal customers," he had told her during the interview, "and we treat them well." That first night, Sarah was trained by another employee named Jake. He was tall, with dark hair and a friendly smile. He seemed to know everything about the store, where every movie was placed, how to work the old register, and even little tricks to make the job easier. "Always keep an eye on the horror section," he joked. "People never put the DVDs back in the right spot." Sarah laughed. Noted. Horror section troublemakers. She liked working with Jake. He was easy to talk to, patient, and fun. The shifts went by quickly whenever he was around. Even when the store was empty, they would chat about movies, life, and the strange quirks of late-night customers. For about a week, everything seemed normal. A strange conversation one evening, while sorting DVDs behind the counter, Sarah casually mentioned Jake to another coworker, Lisa. "Jake's a great trainer," she said. "He made my first week so much easier." Lisa, who had been stacking movies on a nearby shelf, froze. She turned slowly to look at Sarah, her eyebrows furrowed. "Who?" "Jake," Sarah repeated, thinking maybe Lisa hadn't heard her. "The guy who trained me. He mostly works nights." Lisa's face went pale. She shook her head. "Sarah, there's no one named Jake who works here." Sarah let out a small laugh, assuming Lisa was messing with her. "Very funny. But seriously, he's been here every night this week." Lisa didn't smile. Instead, she walked over to the counter and pulled out the employee schedule. She turned the screen toward Sarah. "Look for his name," Lisa said. Sarah leaned in, expecting to find it easily. But as she scanned the list of employees, her stomach tightened. There was no Jake. Not anywhere. She frowned. "That's weird. Maybe he's just not on the schedule today?" Lisa shook her head. "I've worked here for 2 years, and I've never met a Jake." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. That didn't make sense. She had talked to him. She had worked with him. He had trained her. "Maybe he's new like me," she suggested. "Maybe he's not in the system yet." Lisa hesitated, then slowly said, "I think you should talk to Mr. Dawson." Checking the records, feeling uneasy, Sarah waited until her shift ended and approached the manager's office. Mr. Dawson was finishing some paperwork when she knocked on the door. "Got a question?" he asked, looking up from his desk. "Yeah," Sarah said hesitantly. "It's about one of the employees." "Jake." Mr. Dawson frowned. "Jake?" "Yeah," Sarah continued. "He trained me my first few shifts. But Lisa said she's never heard of him, and his name isn't on the schedule." Mr. Dawson's expression changed. He looked unsettled. Slowly, he turned to his filing cabinet and pulled out an old employee logbook. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. Finally, he stopped. He pointed at a name. "Jake Turner." Sarah felt a wave of relief. See, I knew he worked here. But then she looked at the date, 1998. Her stomach dropped. Wait, this can't be right, she whispered. That's over 20 years ago. Mr. Dawson's face was grim. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. Jake was one of our best employees, he said. Smart, hardworking, always helping out. Everyone liked him. Sarah swallowed hard. So, what happened? Mr. Dawson hesitated, then said, He died. Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest. How? Mr. Dawson rubbed his face, as if debating whether to tell her. Finally, he spoke. There was a robbery. A guy came in late at night, demanding money. Jake was working alone in the store. No one knows exactly what happened. But the police said he tried to stop the robber. He didn't make it. Sarah's hands started to shake. But I saw him, she whispered. I talked to him. He trained me. Mr. Dawson stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old staff photo. Is this the Jake you saw? He asked, sliding the photo across the desk. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The same friendly smile. The same dark hair. The same guy who had trained her. But the photo was over 2 decades old. The break room Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Her mind kept racing, replaying every interaction she had with Jake. How had she not noticed? He never touched anything. He never used the register. He was always just there. The next night, after her shift, she made up her mind. She had to check the break room, the place where, according to Mr. Dawson, Jake had died. She waited until the store was empty, then slowly walked to the back of the building. The break room door creaked as she pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, with an old couch, a table, and a vending machine humming in the corner. Everything looked normal. But then, the air grew colder. A chill spread through the room, making the hairs on her arms stand up. She took a shaky step forward, glancing around. Jake? She whispered. Silence. She swallowed hard. If you're here, I just want to know why. The lights flickered. A soft breath of cold air brushed past her neck. And then, just for a second, she heard it. A voice. Be careful as Sarah bolted out of the room, her heart pounding. The last goodbye the next morning, she went straight to Mr. Dawson. I quit, she said, her voice firm. He didn't argue. He just nodded. As she walked out of the store for the last time, she turned back, half expecting to see Jake standing in the doorway, watching her leave. But there was nothing. Just an empty store, filled with the echoes of the past. And somewhere, in the quiet aisles of Blockbuster, the employee who wasn't there remained. The vanishing store's Steve had always loved horror movies. Ever since he was a kid, he would stay up late watching old VHS tapes of classic monster flicks, ghost stories, and slasher films. By the time he was in college in the early 2000s, DVDs were becoming more popular, but he still had a special love for VHS tapes. There was something about rewinding them, the grainy picture, the way they felt in his hands. It was like holding a piece of the past. One Friday night, Steve and his friends, Mark, Lisa, and Danny, decided to have a horror movie marathon. They had watched most of the movies they owned, so they decided to rent something new. Blockbuster was still around, and there was one not too far from Steve's apartment. The strange thing was, none of them had ever noticed it before. It sat on a quiet street, a little off the main road, with a flickering neon sign that read, Blockbuster. The building looked old. The windows slightly fogged up and the parking lot empty. But the moment they stepped inside, it was as if they had walked into the past. Rows of VHS tapes lined the shelves, with only a small section dedicated to DVDs. The carpet had that familiar sticky feel, and the air smelled of stale popcorn in plastic cases. The employees behind the counter stood unnaturally still, their smiles a little too wide, their uniforms slightly outdated. They greeted the group in voices that sounded distorted, like a voice on an old tape that had been played too many times. Steve shivered, but brushed it off. They wandered through the aisles until Lisa gasped. "Look at this," she said, holding up a tape with no cover art. The label was handwritten in red ink. "The Vanishing." "Never heard of it," Mark said, frowning. Danny grabbed it and turned it over, but there was nothing on the back. No description, no rating, nothing. Just the title. "Well, it's a horror night, right?" Steve said. "Let's get it." They took the tape to the counter. The cashier's smile never faded as he rang them up. "Good choice," he said in his odd, warbling voice. "Enjoy." As Steve swiped his card, he glanced at the name tag on the cashier's uniform. The name had faded, as if it had been worn for years. It was hard to read, but it looked like it said Tommy. They left the store feeling a little unsettled, but by the time they got back to Steve's apartment, they were more excited than creeped out. They made popcorn, dimmed the lights, and popped in the tape. The movie started without previews, going straight into the action. It was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old camcorder. It showed a group of teenagers walking into a Blockbuster, the same one they had just been in. "That's weird," Lisa said. "It looks just like..." She stopped talking as the teenagers on the screen picked up a tape titled "The Vanishing." The scene cut to them watching the movie, just like Steve and his friends were doing. Then, one by one, the teenagers started disappearing. At first, they thought it was part of the movie's plot, but as the last teenager vanished, the screen went black. Then the TV turned off on its own. The room was silent. The air felt heavy. Steve's heart pounded. "What the hell was that?" Danny muttered. Steve grabbed the remote and tried to rewind, but the VCR made a loud, screeching noise. The tape wouldn't play again. The label on it, once clearly written, was now smudged and unreadable. Lisa shivered. "I don't like this." "Maybe the tape is damaged," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "We should just return it tomorrow." They agreed and tried to shake off the weird feeling. Eventually, they turned on a regular DVD and watched something else to lighten the mood. By the time they went to bed, they had mostly pushed the strange movie out of their minds. But the next morning, when Steve and Danny drove back to the store, it was gone. Not closed. Gone. The parking lot was empty. There was no sign, no building, nothing. Just cracked pavement and weeds. Steve's stomach dropped. He checked the address on his receipt, but there was nothing there. Just an empty lot. They asked a man at a nearby gas station if he remembered a Blockbuster being there. He looked at them like they were crazy. "There's never been a Blockbuster here," he said. "Not for as long as I've lived here." Steve and Danny exchanged nervous glances. They drove back home in silence. When they got back to Steve's apartment, they checked the tape again. It was blank. No movie, no label, nothing. Just an empty VHS. Lisa and Mark didn't believe them at first, but when they saw the tape, their faces paled. "That doesn't make sense," Lisa whispered. "We all saw it. We all watched it." They didn't know what to do, so they shoved the tape in a box and tried to forget about it. Years passed. They moved on with their lives. The weird night became just another strange memory. Then, one evening, Steve was driving through town and passed by the same street. His breath caught in his throat. The store was back. The neon sign flickered, just like before. Through the window, he could see the same outdated VHS tapes, the same eerie lighting, the same employees. Tommy was standing behind the counter, smiling too wide. Steve's heart pounded. He blinked, and the store was gone. He raced home and tore through his old boxes, searching for the tape, but it wasn't there. It was as if it had never existed at all.